What I have here is a basic line art in Photoshop. There's two layers. One is the sketch layer on the bottom here, and the one on the top is the line art layer. Now obviously the line art's finished and it's completely sealed in, so there's no gaps, and there's a way to check that there's no gaps by selecting the magic wand tool and selecting around the edges, and as long as the little walking ants aren't inside the lines, then you're fine, you haven't got any gaps. So what we want to do is separate each colour on a different layer. So I'm going to start with the main colour here. I'm going to create a new layer that's underneath the sketch, not the sketch layer, the line art layer. So the sketch layer can be turned off if you want, but I like to keep it on sometimes because I don't always put little details in the line art, I keep them in the sketch, but it doesn't matter. So underneath the line art layer you've got a new layer. Now if you click on the line art layer and you select inside the line art all areas that you want to colour. So I'm going to select this area here, and it has selected more or less everything, but there may be some small areas that the magic wand tool has missed. So if you hold shift and click all the areas that it hasn't selected that you want coloured, such as these extra fins here, it will add it to the selection. Now I don't think there's anything else here that it hasn't selected, so I'm going to, from here, assess how thick my lines are. So since I've got a pretty thick line art, I might need to extend this selection a little way so that we don't have any annoying white lines going around the edges. So I go up here, I press select, modify, expand. I usually expand it by 1 or 2. In this case I could probably do 3, but it's not necessary. Usually with a thin line art you can go just by 2. So I'm going to go 2 here, and you can notice that the selection has gone inside the line art a little bit, and this will just prevent it from having any extra white lines, just, well, white areas that are sticking outside the lines, and it just looks a bit ugly. So what I'm actually going to do here is change it to 3. So I'm going to add an extra 1 here, just because I noticed there's a little point sticking out here that wasn't quite selected. So now that that's all selected, I can go back to this new layer that I created earlier, which is my first colour layer. I can select the colour that I need with the paint bucket tool. Just click and it will fill it in like that. Now this is a good point to just go in and check that it has got all the corners, because as you can see here there are some little bits it doesn't quite fill in. I mean, some people don't really pay attention to that, and that's fine, but for me, I'm a bit sort of perfectionist about it, so I've got to fill in all the little gaps that it's left. And depending on how much you expanded the selection, there might be lots or there might be barely any. So I can safely say that that's worked, apart from this little bit here. And then what I want to do is focus on the other areas, the other white areas, before I add details to the purple, because she's not all purple, she has got some green on her. So I'm going to go back to the line art layer and then select all the other white areas. In this case I'm going to do the hair, so I'm going to click and then shift click all the areas that need to be coloured. I'm going to make this hair layer below the purple layer. You can either make it above or below. Below makes it slightly easier to colour any bits that the selection hasn't got, because it will just go underneath the purple layer. So I'm going to make a new layer below the purple one, go back up to the line art layer, and again go select, modify, expand. I'm going to do it by 3 this time because it worked better the last time. Go back to that new layer we just created, find the colour I want, which I will have to select it here because I haven't got it. No. And then paint bucket tool again and click. So that's filled in the hair, so I can fill in all these little gaps, and as we've put it underneath the purple layer, I can freely go like this, fill in all these gaps at the edge, and it won't go over the purple layer because it's below it. Now since I've got such a big line art here, that wouldn't normally be a problem because there's no way I'm really going to go over the line art, whatever the case, but with a thinner line art you have to be a bit more careful. If you've got an unsteady hand like me, you don't want it going everywhere. Just filling in these little bits here. Again, this is something you don't really have to focus on if you're not really bothered about it being perfect, but I get a bit bugged if I see little white bits sticking out. Okay, that'll do for now. Now I'm just going to fill in this last bit using the exact same technique. So, new layer, back to the line art, select, shift click, and then maybe I'm going to have these colour layers exactly the same. You don't have to create a new layer for each different colour. If you've got similar colours, like just a different, slightly different shade of pink or whatever, you can all keep it on one layer, but for me I just find it a bit safer if it's all on a separate layer. That way I don't get things messed up and confused. So pink, see I modified it there again, exactly the same as I did before. Get this pink colour and fill it in like that. So that's all nicely filled in. Now I know there's going to be a lot of gaps around the mouth area, but I'm going to deal with that in a bit. Now this is a part that you can't really use a selection tool for. Well, you can, but I find it easier to just do it by hand, and that's adding the markings to this purple area because she's not just all purple. So I go back and I click on the purple layer here, I create a new layer above it like so, and then I press Ctrl Alt G and this little arrow will appear here, which means it's grouped to this layer below. I don't think the key commands are exactly the same on all devices. I think Macs are slightly different, I think older versions of Photoshop are different, but as long as you've got this little arrow pointing downwards on top of the layer, then that means it's grouped onto it, and it means that you cannot paint outside of this layer. So it's not painting on the layer itself like a transparency lock would, but it's painting on another layer but not going outside the bounds of the layer below. So I want to find the turquoise colour that I need, which is here somewhere. That's not really a great colour, so I'm being a bit fussy about this. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to roughly paint the areas that need painting. Now with colours, as you've seen, I'm being a bit picky with them, but what you can do at any time is just change the colours, just flip them around using the hue and saturation option, which I'll show you in a bit. But for now, just get sort of like the general shape of the markings down, the general colours filled in, and you can tweak them about later. So this is all very rough. As you can see, the edges of the paint are a bit sort of bubbly. It's because I'm using a really big brush. If I was a patient person, I would probably use a smaller brush, but I can't be bothered to do that. I use a big brush and then neaten it up later. So there we get the basic markings done. And I'm using just a hard round brush for this. I don't use any special brushes for colouring or line arting or anything, just the normal hard round, pen pressure, and generally just mucking around with different sizes just to get it exactly how I want. I know people do use special brushes for this sort of thing, but I don't really see the point because the ordinary stuff works just fine. So this gives a general idea of what we're trying to achieve, even if it is a bit of a mess at the moment. Again, you can do the markings all on one layer, even if they're different colours, even if they're different patterns, or you can separate them all into different layers. It's all personal preference, and like I said, for me it's easier to put them onto different layers, because then if I muck up something I can just delete the layer and start again without having to start everything again. So there, that's the general colour scheme we've got down for the body. Now I know there's a lot of details I haven't coloured in. Again, this works exactly the same way as everything else. New layer, line art, select the area you want to colour, modify, expand 3, and then I want a gold for the eyes. Now this is what I do usually resort to, is put in all the details on one layer, because the details are generally quite small and I don't really have to worry about them. So I'm going back to the layer that I did the eye colour on, finding the colour I want for the mouth. And then all that's left is the teeth. So back to the line art layer, using shift click to select them all with the magic wand tool. Oh, if you ever make a mistake and accidentally select the line art like this, just do undo. No, not that. Undo twice in that case. If you do undo, which for me is Control Alt Z, and that should just remove it. That's all the teeth selected, so modify, expand 3, go back to the eye and the mouth layer, you can select a slightly off-white. Sometimes you can click and it will select the whole area. Other times if you've got separate selections like this top selection and this bottom selection, you might have to click on the separate area just to make sure it has filled in. With white it can be hard to tell. So that's the flat colours basically done for this, and there's nothing else I really need to add to it apart from the shading at this point. This is one of the many bonuses of having colours on separate layers, is that if at any point you want to tweak the colour ever so slightly or completely change it, you can, and it's not difficult at all. There's two ways of doing it. Either you select the colour layer that you want, so for instance if I wanted to change this green colour, turquoise colour on her body, I would click on the colour layer itself and I would go to Image, Adjustment, Hue and Saturation, and I would use this tool to change the colour. So sliding this across changes the hue, so I could completely change it to be a different colour if I wanted. Setting this back to 0 resets it to its original colour. I could make it more saturated, like so, make it completely blinding, again setting it back to its usual colour, or I can change the lightness, so I could change it to be completely white, completely black, or somewhere in between. And using a mix of this tool is a lot easier than starting again, because it just changes whatever aspect of the colour you want changing. Another way to do it is a bit more fiddly, but if you need a very precise colour, like a certain hex code or something, this works. So what you'd need to do is this here, which I mentioned before, is the transparency lock button. So you click on the colour you want changing and you click on the transparency lock button, and this will prevent any type of paint from going outside of the already painted areas. So basically drawing on top of it without going over the line. So I'm going to make a big brush here and say I wanted this to be orange. So I've selected this weird looking orange colour and I'm just going to paint on top of it like this, and that changes the colour quite easily, keeps it within the lines, and you're not putting paint everywhere and making a mess. This way does work just as well, but I find it's a bit more sort of permanent, because obviously unless you keep the colours, the specific colour palettes and hex codes and whatever with you, trying to resort back to the colour I was just using before, I'd either have to undo or repaint over it if it was too late to undo. But both ways work. That's just if you ever need to change the colour of the actual painting you've done. The last thing we can do is change the colour of the line art itself. Now I don't tend to do this until after the drawing's finished, because I find it really difficult to tell what colour the line art should be until I've actually shaded everything and finished it off. I know a lot of people start off with a specific colour, like with me I always start off with black because it's just easier to work with as a base colour. But I know people start with browns, they start with very specific colours depending on the type of drawing they're doing. But it's good to play around with what you can do with the line art, because this way, the way I use, isn't permanent. It's exactly the same as what we use for painting the markings on the base colour, and that is creating a new layer above the line art and grouping it below. So Control Alt G, and then what we do is we either say if we want a solid colour to be for the line art, we use the paint bucket to fill the whole area in. See, that changes the line art to a blue colour. Or we can just use the brush tool, which works exactly the same, except you might miss some areas doing it this way. It's not exactly precise to say, but this way you can use gradients. You can change colours of certain areas only, like so. You can change colours of, I don't know, just one tiny little area if you wanted. It doesn't particularly matter. You just play around with it, really. So yeah, that's all there really is to flat colouring and changing the colour of the line art, really.